it seems to me like you made a pretty radical transition from where you started out in industry to to the work that you're doing now. So if you could talk to me a little bit about that and take me through your progression or your evolution.
Sure. My PhD research was in an area called rock fracture mechanics, trying to figure out how best to break rock in a controlled fashion for various reasons.
Yeah.
This was in the mid-1970s. We had our first energy crisis, and most of the energy that we were consuming then and still today is from underground. And so breaking rock is an important process in getting oil or gas, also getting heat in the form of geothermal energy. It's also important to learn how to drill a well or excavate a tunnel by breaking rock. So went to Cornell after finishing my PhD in that area and immediately started doing research, applied research and basic research in the application of rock fracture mechanics to all these energy extraction technologies.
Okay.
And that led by about 1980 to support from the Department of Energy.
Okay.
And then in about 1983 directly from Schlumberger.
Okay.
And I had support from Schlumberger continuously from about 1983 to about 2000. In between there, I got support from what was then called the Gas Research Institute. It's now called the Gas Technology Institute. Schlumberger was very interested in hydraulic fracturing, the science and technology of hydraulic fracturing. And the Gas Technology Institute was interested in pipelines. So I was looking at the problem from both ends, underground and above ground. And also in between did consulting for Exxon, BP. The work with Schlumberger was the longest lived, it was the broadest, the deepest, it involved the most money. I was a professor at Cornell all this time. I was never actually employed by any of these companies. I was working as a contractor, doing research and consulting both, along with some of my students. And the work with Schlumberger was mostly focused on various aspects of hydraulic fracturing.
Okay.
So we can talk about that in detail if you want, but that's that period of 1980 to roughly 2002, 2003 was concentrated experience working above ground, below ground, various companies, many different people, scientists and engineers. Was involved in writing a significant number of peer-reviewed papers and also reports with people from the oil and gas industry. It was a heady time because it was neat. It was neat stuff. But that was well before, with one exception, it was well before any serious commercial interest in shale gas or shale oil.
Okay.
That was happening in the background and well away from all the work I was doing, with one exception. In 1983, I was working on a project at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I was on a sabbatic, my first sabbatic. And DOE was funding research in a project that was more or less called Eastern Devonian Shales. How do you get gas out of Eastern Devonian Shales? Nobody was calling it the Marcellus or the Utica back then. It was just Eastern Devonian Shales. And the project was, what do you have to do to get hydraulic fracturing to work in a rock that's already fractured? So that was my first exposure to shale gas, 1983.
Okay.
And it lasted for about a year while I was there, and then we wrote a couple papers over the next couple of years on what we learned, and then I dropped it. Never looked at shale gas or shale oil again until 2008.
2008? Okay. And what brought that about?
A couple of things happened. I learned from reading the literature and from watching TV and looking at journal ads and newspaper ads and TV ads about the shale gas revolution, which unfortunately people started calling fracking. It's unfortunate. It's the wrong name. So I started reading those articles and advertisements and realized a lot of what I was reading was wrong, or at least incomplete, trying to be polite. Some of it was downright misinformation.
Okay.
To call something polite. And I was concerned. The more I read about it, the more I realized what had happened in that period from 1983 to about 2008. And that's a story everybody knows about. George Mitchell, Range Resources, Terry Engeldet. And Terry and I had known each other for years. We were grad students at roughly the same time and had participated in many conferences together. We actually wrote a paper together. Had chapters in the same books. So I knew Terry, and I knew Terry's name as soon as I started seeing it in the literature. And when he was writing his papers in 2007, 2008, saying that Marcellus was a gigantic find, that's when I really got curious, and I started reading about the techniques that had been developed down here in the Barnett.
Yeah.
So the direct answer to your question from 5 minutes ago is what caused this, what you call a seemingly abrupt transformation from being...
Well, what was the evolution? Yeah, what was the evolution of that? Yeah, what?
Yeah, so I realized that they had developed a technique that was going to get shale gas and shale oil produced, but it was an extreme form of energy production. And by extreme, I mean in terms of scale. The wells were going to be deviated, directional.
Lateral drilling?
There was going to be a heck of a lot of fracking fluid compared to the stuff I was working on. In the 1980s, a massive hydraulic fracturing job in sandstone or limestone was a couple 100,000 gallons. Now we're talking 5 to 10 million gallons. Produce a lot more waste. And because shale gas and shale oil are distributed resources as opposed to concentrated resources, you have to drill everywhere to get them. So you have this unfortunate confluence of a large number of large wells, which means you multiply a large number by a large number and you get a really large number of impacts measured by resources necessary at the surface and underground and waste produced. So your risk goes up no matter how good you are. When you got a lot of material to move, and you have a lot of material to move on a lot of wells, even small incidents, small rates of bad things become large numbers of bad things. It's turning a percentage into a number. So I started to get very concerned, especially when it was coming into my backyard, and I don't have any qualms about saying that. My backyard is Pennsylvania. My backyard is Ohio. My backyard is West Virginia. It doesn't have to be in New York to be in my backyard because the kind of waste we're talking about. We're all downstream and we're all downwind. So, number one, I was concerned about the inaccuracies and misrepresentations and misstatements.
And what were, I mean, could you, if you can remember, what were some of those misrepresentations, those inaccuracies that were being thrown out?
Fracking. What's the big deal? We've been fracking since 1947. What are you worried about? That's a misrepresentation. It's definite.
Explain to me why that is. Explain.
Oh yeah, they've been fracking since 1947. Well, Romans were fracking for that matter. But commercial hydraulic fracturing was born in the late 1940s, and yes, it has been used millions of times around the world, and yes, it has been used 40,000 times in New York State. So, you know, they were driving cars up and down the streets of San Antonio in 1903. I don't see any anymore, and I think the cars and trucks I see now are really different in terms of scale and scope and size and technology. So don't tell me that the same technology we're using in 1947 is the kind of technology that's coming to Pennsylvania. It's not. So I certainly didn't like the idea that they weren't telling the whole story. That they were going to have to drill a whole lot of wells. So that's what I meant when I said before, incomplete information. And when they started to say there's absolutely no human health impact here because there's never been a proven case of groundwater contamination from fracking, well, I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Okay.
Because that's I don't know what the right word to use there is, dissembling. Who the hell cares whether your water well is contaminated by fracking or some other process? It's contaminated. Mm-hmm. But you're saying something that is neither provable nor disprovable, and it's irrelevant. Mm-hmm. What the people want to know is what part of an entire process, not just fracking, is likely to contaminate my groundwater, and how often will it happen? Mm-hmm. And they weren't telling the truth. They're still not telling the truth. Mm-hmm. And the more I read into it, the more I realized that was just one of the potential human health impacts that weren't being accurately communicated to the public, to regulators, and to legislatures.
Is that still happening today? Because when you talk about the whole process being considered instead of just the actual hydraulic fracturing, I think of the report out of the UT Energy Institute, out of the University of Texas Energy Institute, that got a lot of attention.
The Chip Groat report?
Chip Groat report, yeah.
We don't talk about that in public.
Well,
but go ahead. What's the question?
I think that seems to me to be a prime example, because it was at the time.
That's one
sort
example
of parroted.
Misfocusing the scientific investigation at the urging of the industry.
Okay.
So the industry urged Chip Groat's organization in Texas to focus on the question that is least important and an issue that is least likely to occur, which is contamination of groundwater directly from hydraulic fracturing. Mm-hmm. The industry was also quite influential in focusing the ongoing EPA study on exactly that.
What are the most damaging things about the entire process surrounding hydraulic fracturing that bother you?
Well, the single most important is exacerbation of climate change.
Okay.
Because it affects everybody on Earth.
Okay.
And because what we're talking about, shale gas and shale oil, is being exported from Texas to every place on Earth that has shale gas and shale oil. Mm-hmm. So it's going everywhere, or intends to go everywhere, and it affects everybody. So that's the single most important problem by far. Mm-hmm. Which is not to diminish the regional problems and the local problems.
Okay.
So the regional problems have most to do with waste disposal. What do you do with a large amount of solid and liquid waste produced by large amounts of fluid drilled in very long wells, and when you have a large number of wells, what do you do with all that?
Yeah.
That's a regional problem. And I can talk about particular incidences where the inability of the industry to take care of its own garbage and foisting that garbage onto the public resulted in regional disruptions of availability of drinking water. Ask the city of Pittsburgh. Or ask the people who are living downstream of the wastewater treatment plants, which received frac flowback fluid from oil and gas development in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. When everybody knew in the industry that was a really stupid thing to do, because the wastewater treatment plant was designed to treat human waste. It wasn't designed to treat flowback. They knew that. They can't act ignorant at this point. Out, we didn't know. Of course you knew. But you also knew that it was a cheap way of getting rid of your waste, because it's called a publicly owned treatment work, because the public pays for it. You got the public using their tax dollars to treat your waste. That's a good deal, even in Texas. Pardon my irony or sarcasm. So there's these regional waste disposal problems and regional waste impact problems. The airshed doesn't belong to somebody; it belongs to a region. And so, as you saw down in Eagle Ford yesterday, where there are emissions that are going on, those emissions aren't just affecting the person who lives immediately downwind. Those emissions are affecting the region. And the more of them you have in a region, the more effect it has on that region, and the larger the region becomes. So they got global warming at the global scale, climate change at the global scale. You've got regional emissions, air, and regional waste fluids. And then at the local scale, you've got the large number of families who, in the various states where shale gas has been developed and shale oil is being developed, getting their drinking water from private drinking water wells. And those drinking water wells are being contaminated. Not necessarily by fracking directly. I have no doubt that some have, although the industry will deny it until their last gasp of natural gas. But the mere act of drilling that many wells so close to people's drinking water wells inevitably causes contamination. And the industry knows that. I can point you to dozens of papers where the opening paragraph of a paper written by somebody in the oil and gas industry says, loss of zonal isolation, loss of structural integrity, leaking, failing cement jobs are known to cause environmental problems, including contamination of private drinking water wells. I am not the first person to say that. The very first people to ever write that were people in the oil and gas industry. They've been writing it for 50 years. Surprise, surprise. But now it's, as long as, speaking for the industry, as long as we can keep focusing it on fracking, we can keep denying it. We don't want them to think about the other problem, which is just drilling and casing and cementing. So at the local level, the major problem is contamination of private drinking water wells and surface waters because of leaking wells. The industry knows it. They've known it for years. They've been writing papers about it for years. They know that they can't make the problem go away completely.
Well, what was the genesis of your paper? Because I'd like to get to your 2011, the study that you co-authored.
That's addressing the global problem.
That addresses the global problem.
So in 2009, I met Bob Howarth, who's another professor at Cornell, for the first time. He's in a different college, in a different building. We had never met. We went to lunch one day, and he asked about my experience in the oil and gas industry, like the conversation we're having. Matter of fact, I probably recounted more or less the same things we just talked about. And he said, well, I want to do some scientific investigations, and here's the question, here's the science question I want to address. Natural gas is a clean fossil fuel. Is that a true statement of science? And I emphasize, you didn't come to me and said, help me prove that natural gas is not a clean fossil fuel. That's not science. That's science-driven or advocacy-driven science. Take a position first and then try to find the science to prove it. That's not what he asked. He said, look, the industry, regulators, legislators around the world are saying that shale gas is a clean fossil fuel. Is it? No one's asked the question. No one even asked the question. So let's ask the question and let's do what we can to try to answer it. So that was the start in 2009. So we worked with Renee Santoro, and my job was very simple. Bob is an environmental ecologist, and Renee worked in his lab as a technician and a researcher, and I knew what I knew about oil and gas production. So they wanted to know where would emissions occur, and why would they occur, and when would they occur across the entire life cycle, from the time the first bulldozer shows up to clear a pad to the time that methane molecule gets burned. Where might it leak? Okay.
So life cycle emissions, not just the burning of natural gas.
Right. So the essence of the question came down to these things. When you compare natural gas, methane, let's just call it this, methane. When you compare methane to coal or oil, and you burn them, they're all fossil fuels. They all produce carbon dioxide. But for the same amount of energy produced by burning them, methane produces much less carbon dioxide than coal or oil. True, incontrovertible scientific fact. But the question was not, is methane a cleaner fossil fuel when it's burned? The question was, is methane a cleaner fossil fuel, period? So you then have to look not only at the carbon dioxide that's produced, but you have to look at the other greenhouse gases that might be involved. And that's what no one else had done for shale gas. There was nothing in the literature addressing the question, is shale gas a clean fossil fuel? There were a few papers in literature on, is methane a clean fossil fuel? And those papers were old. They were 7, 8, 9 years old. So we decided to try to update the literature. So over a period of roughly 2 years, we did what's called a paper study. The correct way to answer the question would be to go out and make measurements. From the time the first bulldozer shows up to clear the path to the time you burn that methane molecule, measure how much is leaking along the way. And that had never been done, and here we are 4 years later, and it still hasn't been done.
Well,
it's being done.
What, in your opinion, why has that been such a battle? Why has that been such a battle to get good emissions inventories?
It's obvious the industry doesn't want people to know. And to a certain extent, legislators and regulators that have already bought into the policy decision that it's a good thing, shale gas is a good thing, they've already bought into that policy decision. They don't want to be seen as being what's the right word here? The opposite of hesitant, too quick. Help me with my vocabulary, it's late in the afternoon. They don't want to back up.
Yeah.
If you're a legislator, you don't want to say, oh, we made a mistake. If you're a regulator, you don't want to say, oh, we made a mistake. We should have waited for the science. You made a policy decision. Texas did, Arkansas did, Louisiana did, West Virginia did, Pennsylvania did. They said, go baby, drill baby, drill. We'll figure out the science later. So we did a paper study, meaning that we got as much information and data as we could from the literature, from industry. We made many, many phone calls, many emails, many letters to people in the oil and gas industry asking them for data and information, and many of them responded. Many of them helped. Others said, forget about it. We assembled data from government agencies, from published reports from the industry, from unpublished reports from the industry, from personal testimony from the industry, from what few papers had been published in related areas, and over a period of 2 years we put together an assessment of what the likely levels of methane emissions are. And we didn't make a number, we didn't say it's 4.2% of total production, although we're accused of that. What we said was, since no measurements have ever been made over the entire life cycle, we don't know what the answer is. But we think the answer, based on the information that's currently available, as poor as the information is, the answer is likely to be between this number and this number. It's a pretty wide range, more than a factor of 2. So that's the first thing we said. Second thing we said is, we better go make measurements, because this is a really important question. You shouldn't be making policy decisions about increasing the production of a fossil fuel before figuring out whether using that fossil fuel as a substitute for other fossil fuels is better for climate change or worse than climate change. Or whether increased production of that fossil fuel, which will decrease the production of renewable energies, helps or hurts climate change. Those are policy issues. You should have data, at least probabilities, that you should be doing one thing rather than another. So that's what we encouraged. And for that we were attacked, pilloried, discredited.
And the reason for that being, I mean, do you think the reason for that was it undermined one of the main arguments for continuing shale gas exploration for...
Absolutely. It called into question. It didn't undermine, it called into question. I would not say that paper undermined anything. It called into question. It asked a question that should have been asked years before and wasn't. And the question, I repeat, still hasn't been answered. So yeah, it upset people. I'm repeating myself. It upset people in the industry because obviously there are investments, huge hundreds of billions of dollars of capital were moving around all over the world, betting, right? All capital is risked, betting that there was going to be an increase in shale gas and shale oil production. And legislators and regulators in many jurisdictions, countries, states had already set policy. So had the federal government. So is the federal government. When President Obama says all the above, he really means all of the below. All of the below.
Or when he says there's 100 years of shale gas.
There isn't. That's a conversation that would take hours to discuss.
Yeah.
But let's put it this way. If 2 years ago, during his State of the Union address, and he said, we think we have about at least 100 years, or as much as 100, he said as much as 100 years of gas locked up in shale formations. If somebody had whispered in his ear that, Mr. President, the oil and gas industry would really like to export 40 to 60% of it, okay, where's our promised energy independence if we're selling it to the highest payer? And from the climate change point of view, in his most recent State of the Union address, he finally said climate change is really important. And he knows, as well as I know, because he's more informed than I am, that if you have 100 years of shale gas, you're not going to get to use the last 70 years of it. Because climate change will pretty much change the way we live. Not in good ways, within the next 30 years. So, yeah, we wrote the paper, we asked the question, and we upset a lot of people.
I guess the last point I want to go over with you is what needs to be done from a policy standpoint. I mean, obviously, encouraging true emissions inventories to answer that question is one, but do states need to ban it until that question's answered? States that haven't?
Here's my personal policy position. Take it for what it's worth. One Ivy League professor engineer stating his policy position. Wherever shale gas and shale oil production is currently not happening, it shouldn't happen. Wherever it is happening, it should not be accelerated. It should be decelerated. Wherever it is happening, not only should it be decelerated, it should be done with what I call the toughest regulations, toughly enforced by knowledgeable inspectors, and any faults in the system have to be fined at levels that hurt. So if a company is going to spend $5 million drilling a gas well and expect to produce $20 million of gas from it, and knows that they've committed a major environmental fault and has to pay a $50,000 fine, I mean, what do you do? Big deal. So, okay, sorry. If on the other hand, they're told that the next time that a private water well is contaminated by your gas drilling, you're going to pay a fine equal to 50% of the value of the gas you produce. They're going to work much harder to make sure that their cement jobs are really good. And they're going to make much better efforts, rather than paying a $50 million fine, or 50% fine, to go to the agreed landowner and say, we hurt you, and now here are your choices. Okay, we will supply you forever with fresh drinking water in any way you want. Or we'll pay you 10 times the value of your land before the water well was contaminated. Not twice, 10 times. Make them happy, because you really made them sad. Make them happy again. So there's my personal policy, and it's the frame for that personal policy is climate change, regional waste disposal, and local impacts. If you can figure out a way to avoid all those, then that's great. The only way to truly avoid all those is stop producing shale gas and shale oil. Is that realistic? To immediately stop it? No. Will in my opinion, will we see an inevitable slowdown in the development and use of fossil fuels? Yes, for two reasons. In the long term, because we're running out of them. That might take another 2 generations. But in the short term, because as climate change gets worse, people are going to become more and more accepting of the idea that it's our use of fossil fuels that largely the cost, and they're going to be more willing to substitute. And the more willing they are to substitute renewable green forms of energy, the less demand there's going to be for fossil fuels. And at some point in the future, Exxon, BP, and Chevron are going to hear from their shareholders that they need to morph their companies into producing green energy. That'd be a miracle. I mean, I don't want Exxon to fold as a company. I don't want Chevron to fold as a company. I want them to do what a smart company would do. Change horses in midstream. Read the future. You've got the smartest people. The smartest engineers and scientists are working in the oil and gas industry. And they'll tell you, they want to have a job 20 years from now. And that job is going to be producing a different form of energy.
You know, setting aside the debate over the impact that massive shale gas development might have on renewables and whether or not they can truly ever be considered a bridge fuel, right? Could industry put in place safeguards and mechanisms as it stands right now that would truly make it a cleaner burning fuel that would make it better than, say, oil and coal?
It's a great question, and excuse me while I try to deconvolve it.
Okay.
So you can compare shale gas to its sister fossil fuels, but you also need to compare shale gas to green energy sources.
Okay.
Wind, water, solar. So let's take the first comparison. Could the industry develop and deploy technologies to substantially reduce methane emissions? Yes, undoubtedly. Could they ever make those emissions go to zero? No, impossible. So now the question becomes not comparing methane to coal and oil, it becomes comparing methane to wind, water, solar. So the 2/3 of methane that's currently used in the United States for things other than electricity generation, like heating our homes and driving our cars, there's no advantage to methane. It's the only thing that's used, methane. That's the only thing methane's used for. Not completely, but mostly. It's heating, home heating, industry heating. Can't use it to drive our cars unless we shift to CNG cars, and I just said that takes us in the wrong direction for emissions. So now the question becomes, why would we want to increase shale gas development to continue heating our homes when we can use wind, water, and solar in our homes? Why would we want to convert fleets of buses or trucks or cars to use natural gas as a fuel when we can use electricity from wind, water, and solar as a fuel? The answer is simple. The fuel cost here is zero. Nobody owns it. Nobody owns it. You can't lease sunlight. You can't drill for wind, right? And that puts this industry in its current configuration out of business. I mean, it's a no-brainer why the oil and gas industry doesn't like renewables. There's no fuel cost. So.